This lecture will cover the events of the first 10 years of the Peloponnesian War. This phase of the war is often referred to as the Archidamian War, named after the Spartan king, King Archidamus, who led annual invasions from Sparta into the Attic Peninsula. You may remember from previous lectures that, according to Thucydides, the war erupted because of the escalating tension between Athens and Corinth over Corcyra and Potidaea in the north, and the refusal of the Athenians to rescind the Megarian decree, despite the Spartans' adamant demand that they do so. So, given these immediate causes, which exacerbated the tensions that increasingly defined the relationship between Athens and Sparta, it's no surprise that ultimately both sets of alliances, the Athenian Delian League and the Spartan Peloponnesian League, would find themselves at war. Now, many scholars believe that Pericles had been planning for a confrontation with Sparta for some time. You remember that Pericles was the dominant figure in Athens, having been re-elected year after year after year as one of the strategoi, or generals. So he had great political influence and could shape Athens' long-term strategy. Now, Pericles had a very unusual idea as to how the Athenians could emerge victorious from any conflict with the Spartans, and it is basically a defensive strategy. The Athenians had completed what were called the Long Walls, linking the city of Athens with their main port of Piraeus, and creating a secure conduit by which supplies could be shipped in from Egypt or the Black Sea area, supplies of corn and grain, and the Athenian population could be fed. Now, in short, Pericles expects the conflict to go on for 2, maybe 3 years, in which he fully expects that the Spartans will invade Attica and ravage the countryside, because that's what hoplite warfare was all about. And, of course, the Spartans were exemplars of hoplite warfare. And the idea would be that, from the Spartan perspective, that the Athenians would be outraged by this invasion and would come running out to meet the Spartans in a hoplite engagement, and very quickly the Spartans would win that battle and thus end the war. And again, this was the usual trajectory of hoplite warfare. But Pericles had anticipated this. He had anticipated this Spartan strategy, and he obviously did not want to play the Spartan game. He knew that the Spartans fielded the best army, ground force, in ancient Greece, and did not want to tangle with such a force. Instead, he believed that if he could get the rural population of Attica to shelter within the city of Athens and within the Piraeus, even within the conduit of the Long Walls, you could set up temporary housing there, basically evacuate the countryside. And yes, the Spartans will burn farms and crops, but they're not going to do any long-term damage. Indeed, Pericles bets that Athens will be able to feed this population, which could have numbered as many as several 100,000, by using the Athenian navy to ship in grain and other foodstuffs. And after a while, the Spartans will get tired of playing this game. Again, the Spartans were not set up for siege warfare. So negotiations would begin, and a peace settlement would be agreed upon, and Sparta would have to concede that the Athenians could not be defeated. So this very unusual strategy went against the conventions of hoplite warfare, and it became very distressing indeed when ultimately the two sides do declare war on one another. And the Athenian hoplite class has to kind of stand on the walls and watch their farms burn and endure this humiliation. But, the Periclean influence is strong, and Pericles is able, through his oratory, his rhetoric, his public speaking ability, to convince the Athenians to just hold on, this will work, just give it some time. But politically, it does become an increasingly tough sell to the Athenian people. Now, that's not to say that the Athenian strategy, the Periclean strategy, was without an offensive component. Pericles did call for Athens to use some of its naval force to raid along the Peloponnesian coast. But we have to remember that although Athens had a formidable navy, that navy was tasked with a couple of really big missions. Number one, to patrol the Aegean, making sure that Athens' quote-unquote allies in the Delian League stayed loyal, and you better believe that required a significant naval presence. The second mission, to ensure that the food that is being shipped and the food supplies are on schedule, on time, and are not being picked off at sea. So guarding these food convoys was a key, a cornerstone to Pericles' defensive strategy. If you can't feed the Athenian people, then it all falls apart. And finally, number three was to, and here's the offensive component, was to engage in raids along the Peloponnesian coast. So this all stretched the Athenian navy pretty thin, and it also prevented the Athenians from delivering a knockout blow against the Peloponnesians in the Peloponnese while the Spartan army was in Attica burning down farms and stuff. So neither side can generate that knockout blow that, again, usually defined the traditions of ancient Greek warfare. So that's why we're going to see this conflict go on and on and on for 27 years. Now, the big flaw in Pericles' defensive strategy of having most of the population of Attica crammed within the confines of Athens and the Piraeus during the summer months was the threat of disease. And one of the most compelling and tragic parts of Thucydides' history is his description of the Great Plague, which struck Athens in 430. And this is one of your assigned readings. It's only a few pages, but it is, again, quite compelling. Now, this plague probably broke out because of overcrowding, lack of hygiene, and although the disease has never really been, identified conclusively, most scientific historians believe that it was likely typhoid. And by the time it had run its course, it probably had killed an estimated 25% of the Athenian population, including Pericles, who himself was struck down by the disease in 429. Now, Thucydides was infected himself, yet somehow managed to survive this harrowing ordeal. And, as I said, this is one of the most gripping parts of Thucydides' history because he makes clear the toll which the plague took on Athenian society, not just in terms of mortality, but also an erosion of civic virtue and a falling away of religion, which led to lawlessness, and a complete lack of morality, marked by extraordinary greed, selfishness, and hedonism. So again, it becomes quite a problem, not just a medical problem, but it becomes a kind of a social, civic problem. Now, Pericles' death in 429 creates a political vacuum, which ultimately is going to be filled by non-aristoi demagogues. And of course, demagogue is a Greek term. It's used to describe a leader who gains popularity in a democracy by exploiting emotions, prejudice, and ignorance to arouse the common people. And of course, according to the rules of rhetoric, there are three ways to make your argument: logos, pathos, ethos. And of course, logos is all about appealing to the logic of your audience and their rational mindedness. On the other hand, pathos is all about arousing the emotions, oftentimes negative emotions, that cause people to think irrationally and do irrational things. So, according to Thucydides, this new breed of politician, these demagogues, were all about appealing to the negative emotions of the common people. And the most prominent of this new crop of fiery politicians was Cleon, who was the son of a leather merchant. And Cleon comes to prominence first during what is known as the Mytilenean debate. And this event, this debate, occurs in Athens when, in 428, the polis of Mytilene, located on the island of Lesbos, wanted to leave the Delian League. And, of course, the Athenians are not having any of that, so they send a fleet that will blockade Mytilene, and ultimately Mytilene will surrender after a fairly lengthy siege. So this was on top of, enduring the plague and the Spartan invasions of Attica. Now we're starting to see some tension within the Delian League, and the Athenians are feeling very hard-pressed. So back in Athens, after the Mytileneans people had surrendered, back in Athens, Cleon put forth a motion that all the males of Mytilene should be executed and the women and children sold into slavery. And the Athenian assembly, fired up by Cleon's rhetoric, initially approves this harsh punishment. But the next day, the assembly reconvenes to debate the punishment again. Again, there was probably some soul-searching and some recognition that perhaps we've gone too far. So Cleon, in the day 2 of this episode, is going to be opposed by another Athenian, Diodotus, who advises that in the long run it would be better for Athens if only the ringleaders of the revolt were executed. And then the Athenian people vote that, yes, Diodotus's position is the correct one, so we will approve that. But the problem was that a trireme had been sent out a day earlier to send the original order of mass execution to the Athenians at Mytilene. And so there's this dramatic episode where another trireme is sent in the hope of getting there in time to prevent the mass slaughter that the Athenian people had initially ordered. And the story has somewhat of a happy ending because the second order, a more lenient policy, gets there in time, and again, mass slaughter is prevented, although there are a large number of Mytilenean men who are identified as ringleaders who ultimately will be executed. So in these speeches, we gain an insight into how the Athenians thought that they should rule their empire. And we can clearly see that the subtle oppressiveness that marked the early phase of the Athenian empire has now been replaced by a creeping ruthlessness. And this is a theme we will explore further in the last part of this lecture. So Cleon now seems to be the most popular politician in Athens at this time, and his next move is to convince the Athenians to discard Pericles' defensive strategy and instead go on the offensive. So the Athenians decide to follow this policy, this new offensive policy, and a naval expedition is dispatched to the west coast of the Peloponnese. And it's led by a guy named Demosthenes, who seems to have been an Athenian commander of some brilliance. And I'll spare you the details, but this Athenian force lands on the island of Pylos, which is just off the coast of the Peloponnese, here located in red on my map on the west coast of the Peloponnese. And they begin fortifying an area in hope of triggering a helot revolt, which, of course, as you can imagine, would destabilize the entire geopolitical situation for the Spartans. So this Athenian plan proceeds, and of course, once the Spartans hear about an Athenian force landed so close to a very sensitive area of the Peloponnese, the Spartans stop immediately what they're doing and gather together a force. It's about 420 Peloponnesian hoplites, and they land this force on the island of Sphacteria. And here on this map you can see Sphacteria in close proximity to where the Athenians had fortified their position at Pylos. But the problem was, of course, that this Spartan force was dependent upon Peloponnesian naval support, and the Athenian navy was the best fleet in town. So the Peloponnesian navy is vanquished, leaving these 420 Peloponnesian hoplites, including a sizable number of homoioi, Spartan homoioi, trapped on this island of Sphacteria. And after some back and forth and several battles, this force of Spartans and Peloponnesians surrenders to the Athenians. And this came as a shock to everybody, especially, I suppose, the Athenians, that a Spartan force would choose to surrender rather than go down fighting like they had at Thermopylae. So the Athenians now have a sizable number of Peloponnesian prisoners, including 120 full homoioi. And we might imagine that the Spartans, who were always very selective in their kind of eugenic-based population program, they were feeling the pinch for manpower, and they felt this loss very keenly. And they did not want to see these 120 homoioi executed by the Athenians. So now the Athenians have an ace card that they can play in getting the Spartans to the negotiating table. Now, back in Athens, Cleon had persuaded the Athenians to reject the Spartan request for negotiations, and the war is going to drag on for 4 more years. Now, it's at this point that Thucydides introduces us to a Spartan commander of some brilliance named Brasidas, who is able to get the Athenians to sit down at the negotiating table when in 424, this Spartan commander Brasidas will take an army northward to the Athenian city of Amphipolis, which is up near Macedonia. Brasidas is able to capture this city, and this puts the Athenians in a tough spot because Amphipolis was home to a lot of timber and a lot of gold mines. And without it, the Athenians would be in a hard place because, of course, the gold was for finances, the timber was for triremes, building triremes. So this is also, as a side note, besides being a tough blow for the Athenians, this is also the campaign which caused Thucydides, our historian, to be exiled from Athens because he was blamed by the Athenian people for the initial loss of Amphipolis. So with both Athens and Sparta momentarily exhausted, an Athenian named Nicias is able to finally negotiate a peace that is acceptable, for the most part, to both parties. And this is going to be known as the Peace of Nicias, and it's going to be signed in 421. Now, the Peace of Nicias was supposed to last for 50 years, but almost as soon as it's signed, it's going to begin to break down because neither party, and we'll also see the allies, particularly the Peloponnesian League members, are not quite happy with how things have turned out. So the fighting will continue on a kind of a low-intensity scale, and we'll see that things are going to continue to remain tense. But technically, now that we've reached the year 421, this ends the phase of the war called the Archidamian War. Now, although it falls beyond this 10-year window, I want to close this lecture with a brief synopsis of what is known as the Melian Dialogue. Indeed, this is going to be the topic of your unit essay question. Now, in 416, so, we're about 5 years after the Peace of Nicias has been agreed upon, in 416, an Athenian force besieges this tiny city-state on the island of Pylos, situated just south of the Peloponnese, here on my map, circled in red. Now, Pylos was not technically a member of either the Peloponnesian League or the Delian League. It was kind of a neutral party, but it was sympathetic to Sparta. At least that's what the Athenians believed. And even though the Melians had taken no active part in the war, They may have made a monetary contribution to the Spartan war effort. At least that's going to be one of the charges levied against them by the Athenians. So in 416, the Athenians arrive on the island with a sizable fleet, and they demand that Pylos support the Delian League or face destruction. But the Melians refuse to submit despite the clearly overwhelming superiority of Athenian power. And there is this type of debate that goes on. I mean, technically it's a dialogue, but it is framed also as a debate between the Athenian representatives and the Melian representatives over what Pylos should do. Now, ultimately, the Melians refuse to submit to Athenian authority. A siege is conducted, and ultimately the Melians are forced to surrender. And all of its males, all of its men are killed, and the women and children are sold into slavery. So there is this type of trajectory that the Athenians have been on that we explored earlier with the Mytilenean debate between Cleon and Diodotus, and how ultimately at the last minute many of the Mytileneans are spared execution because the Athenians have reconsidered their initial position. Well, here, 11 years after the Mytilenean incident had occurred, now we're at Pylos in 416, now that threat is carried out, and all the males, all the Melian men are killed, and all the women and children are indeed sold into slavery. So this again represents a theme of degeneration that exists throughout the history that Thucydides has written. And what we see here is this Melian dialogue. It offers a chillingly realistic insight into the clash between ethics and power in international politics. And it's one of the principal examples of political realism, the idea that might makes right, that frames this book. And of course, this is one of the reasons why the book is still studied in every international relations program in the world, because of the insights, no matter how dismal or grim, those insights are still relevant to studying sometimes the unfortunate nature of relationships between nations or states.